In our previous episode, we revisited how Mao Zedong, in his struggle for absolute power, systematically transformed tens of millions of students into instruments of violence, and how, once the political purges were complete, he discarded that force without hesitation. But how devastating was that catastrophe in reality? After Mao's death, Hua Guofeng described it in an internal meeting as having pushed the national economy to the brink of collapse. Marshal Ye Jianying was even more explicit. Around 20 million people died unnatural deaths, and more than 100 million were persecuted in one form or another. And today, as growing numbers of young people, crushed by their present circumstances and overwhelmed by despair, begin to nostalgically glorify that catastrophe online, we are forced to confront a critical reality. The real question is not whether the Cultural Revolution was a tragedy. The question is whether today's China once again possesses the social conditions capable of igniting another one. In this episode, we will conduct a systematic CT scan of contemporary China and place it side by side with the Mao era on the same analytical map to see where history appears to be repeating itself and where it has fundamentally deformed. The first thing we see is a set of strikingly similar structural crises. Politically, absolute power is once again under unprecedented pressure. After the failure of the Great Leap Forward, Mao's authority was badly damaged. What he feared most was being purged by his own party. That is why he felt compelled, while still alive, to eliminate every potential Khrushchev, a reference to the Soviet leader who denounced Stalin after his death, in order to secure his own position. Today, Xi Jinping's situation is even more dangerous than Mao's was. He does not possess Mao's godlike prestige. His rise to power depended instead on an unprecedented anti-corruption campaign. According to official figures, millions of officials have been investigated, and hundreds of senior officials at the provincial and ministerial level have fallen. In doing so, he has effectively offended the entire bureaucratic class. Now, with his grip on the military visibly weakened, Xi understands one thing very clearly. The moment he loses power, the system will turn on him, and the political reckoning will be extraordinarily brutal. Economically, the model of high-speed growth is reaching its end. Back then, the failure of the Great Leap Forward marked the collapse of the planned economy. It resulted in roughly 30 million unnatural deaths, a comprehensive industrial regression, mass factory shutdowns, and severe urban unemployment. The national economy stood on the edge of collapse, and public resentment boiled over. Today, what we are witnessing is the complete exhaustion of the reform and opening up dividend. The real estate bubble has burst. Land-based fiscal revenue, the lifeline of local governments, has collapsed. Foreign capital is withdrawing on a large scale, and young people are facing an unemployment crisis unprecedented in modern China. The anger of ordinary people over unfair resource distribution is just as intense as it was back then, and history has shown again and again that economic decline is the most fertile soil for social unrest. The third parallel is the most direct and the most dangerous: the widespread despair among young people at the bottom of society. In Mao's era, young people saw all paths of upward mobility abruptly sealed when the national college entrance exam was abolished. Their only remaining option was to follow Mao into so-called revolutionary rebellion. Today's young generation faces an even more psychologically torturous predicament. On the surface, upward mobility appears to still exist, but in reality, it has long since become hollow. Social classes have solidified. Involution, a zero-sum rat race, and lying flat, a quiet withdrawal from society, have become the norm. Young people see this with brutal clarity. No matter how hard they work, whether it is 996 or even 007, they are merely burning themselves as fuel for an already entrenched elite class, while receiving none of the rewards. This profound sense of disillusionment drives them to fantasize about a great reshuffle, a violent reset that could smash the suffocatingly unjust system they live in. Their anger has become the cheapest and most readily exploitable political fuel available to those in power. But history never repeats itself in a simple or mechanical way. Despite all these similarities, today's China still has several critical breaks, preventing the wheel of history from fully reversing. The first is the collective resistance of the bureaucratic elite. In Mao's time, most officials had fought alongside him in the revolution and still harbored emotional loyalty and personal reverence. Open resistance was unthinkable. Today's bureaucrats and elites, by contrast, are the biggest beneficiaries of 40 years of economic reform. They control unimaginable wealth. A cultural revolution that smashes everything would amount to a revolution against their own lives. They will not follow a new Mao Zedong into madness. Instead, they will resist passively through inaction, foot-dragging, and bureaucratic sabotage, quietly undermining any extreme policy that threatens their core interests. Another break lies in China's deep entanglement with economic globalization. Mao's China was a sealed-off economy, isolated from the world, able to destroy itself behind closed doors. Today's China is the world's factory and a central node in global supply chains. Launching a mass social upheaval that destroys production order and scares away all foreign capital would be nothing short of economic suicide. That outcome serves no one's interests, including those at the very top. A third break is the fundamental transformation of information channels. In Mao's era, state media monopolized all information. If Mao said the sun was square, people were expected to believe it. Today, despite censorship and the Great Firewall, that monopoly has been irreversibly broken. Hundreds of millions of people, through VPNs, overseas connections, and alternative channels, have access to information beyond state control. More importantly, 4 decades of market economy have profoundly reshaped public awareness of personal property and individual rights to a degree utterly incomparable to the Mao era. And finally, the most fundamental break of all is this: the Communist Party's capacity for mass mobilization has largely collapsed. Mao Zedong could command instant nationwide obedience because of a godlike cult of personality and a fanatical belief in communist ideals cultivated over decades. His words were treated as sacred decrees, instantly translated into voluntary action of hundreds of millions. That foundation no longer exists. But today, the situation is fundamentally different. Decades of political lies, combined with the post-reform and opening up era's open promotion of money above all else, have completely destroyed the credibility of official ideology. The public, especially younger generations, now exhibits deep, almost instinctive distrust toward the government and state media. The entire system has fallen into what political science calls the Tacitus trap. No matter what the party says or does, people instinctively assume it is lying or simply trying to extract more from them. Under this atmosphere of apathy and cynicism, Xi Jinping has lost the one ability Mao Zedong once possessed: the power to issue a call from above and be met with mass, voluntary mobilization. Xi can still rely on the coercive force of the state apparatus, as he did during the COVID lockdowns, but that approach ultimately triggered resistance in the form of the white paper protests. A Mao-style mass movement driven by genuine ideological fervor is, for Xi, virtually impossible. So, if he can no longer launch a real cultural revolution, how will Xi Jinping deal with the mess he now faces? The answer is that he can only pursue the same objective through a far more insidious and modern method. To understand this, we must first grasp a crucial fact. The core of Xi's power is built entirely on a negative logic. Under Mao, and later under Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, and Hu Jintao, the system still contained clear forms of positive incentives. Mao offered ideological rewards. He told people, "Join my revolution, smash the old world, and you will become part of a new one. Together, we will build a utopia." This was a grand promise at the spiritual level.
Deng, Jiang, and Hu, by contrast, offered material incentives. Their message to both officials and ordinary citizens was simple: give up political ambition, and in return, you will be allowed to pursue prosperity. Different packaging, same logic. As long as you obey, you will be rewarded.
What Xi inherited, however, was a system in which this positive exchange had completely collapsed. No one believes in the ideology anymore, and the story of rapid growth and shared prosperity can no longer be told. That leaves him with only one option: to establish a rulebook that operates in the exact opposite direction. This logic, already visible from the start of the anti-corruption campaign, no longer promises "follow me and you will gain something." Instead, it warns, if you do not follow me, you will lose everything: your wealth, your position, your family, even your life. This is a system of rule built entirely on fear. Once we understand this negative logic, we can no longer ignore the tool in Xi's hands, one far more powerful than anything Mao ever possessed. A highly efficient, highly precise political cleansing machine, fully armed with disciplinary bodies, state security agencies, and advanced surveillance technology. This is the true core of the so-called new cultural revolution. Compared to the original, it differs fundamentally in its enforcers, its targets, and its ultimate purpose. In the old Cultural Revolution, the main executors were the Red Guards, an externally mobilized, mass-based force hastily manufactured for the campaign. Today, Xi is incapable of doing that. The only force he can rely on comes from within the system itself, the disciplinary inspection bodies and the state security apparatus. And what drives this internal force is not belief, but fear. These agencies themselves are constantly being purged. For those inside them, the only way to survive is to keep arresting others, to use the downfall of others as proof of loyalty in exchange for temporary safety. But that alone is not enough. Xi does not merely want to purge the bureaucracy. He wants to absorb society itself into this stability maintenance machine, turning the entire population into its peripheral nervous system. He has revived the Mao-era Feng Chao experience, encouraging the masses to struggle against the masses, urging people to monitor and report on one another. Combined with omnipresent neighborhood grid management and strict control over all online speech, he is constructing a three-layered architecture of fear: disciplinary and security organs as the blade, digital surveillance as the net in the sky, and mass informants as the net on the ground. The targets of this cleansing system are also fundamentally different from the old Cultural Revolution. Back then, enemies were relatively clear, labels like the 5 black categories or capitalist roaders. In the so-called New Cultural Revolution, the enemy is vague, fluid, and can be generated at any moment. A person's political status can flip instantly, from trusted insider to prisoner, often in the span of a single decision. This uncertainty stems from two inescapable paradoxes inherent to authoritarian rule. The first is the Praetorian Guard paradox. In any highly centralized system, the only force truly capable of staging a coup and threatening the supreme leader is the very force entrusted with protecting him, the military. As a result, senior military figures inevitably become long-term targets of repeated purges. From Xu Caiho to He Weidong, this logic has never ceased. The second paradox arises from the fundamental conflict between loyalty and competence, and this conflict is further magnified by another political reality: the supreme leader can never be wrong. Xi demands absolute loyalty from officials, but loyalty is an internal state that cannot be directly measured, while competence is clearly reflected through achievements. A truly capable official who pushes bold reforms and solves difficult social problems will inevitably gain public prestige. In Xi's eyes, that prestige itself becomes a threat to his personal authority, a classic case of merit overshadowing the ruler. But if you do nothing and merely shout slogans, you are accused of being a two-faced person and told such officials must be removed.
And if you actually try to do something and fail, sorry, since the supreme leader is never wrong, all policy failure must fall on the executing officials. So here is the trap. If you do nothing, you risk being purged for insufficient loyalty. If you succeed, you risk suspicion for overshadowing the ruler. If you fail, you will be sacrificed as a scapegoat, publicly destroyed to preserve the image of the leader's infallibility. As a result, the targets of the new cultural revolution are no longer a fixed social class, but a constantly shifting death list, rewritten at will by the leader's paranoia and fear. And this reveals the most fundamental difference in purpose between the two movements. The original cultural revolution sought to destroy order through chaos in order to rebuild it, to smash the old machine and replace it with a new one. The new cultural revolution, by contrast, aims to do the opposite. Through endless purges, it seeks only to keep a decaying zombie system staggering forward, barely alive, but not yet allowed to collapse. Yet even this is still not enough to confront reality. An internal purge centered on hunting traitors may ease Xi's anxiety toward the party and the military, but it does nothing to suppress the rage accumulating across society, especially among young people at the bottom. And that rage is not abstract, it is powerful enough to shake the foundations of the regime itself. Xi Jinping must find an outlet for it, but he dares not, as Mao once did, to direct that fury inward toward the bureaucratic apparatus. He fears that once unleashed, that anger could merge with discontent inside the bureaucracy and the military, and ultimately turn back on him. Since internal contradictions cannot be resolved, he is left with only one option: to redirect them outward. Xi releases this pressure through a form of fascistic nationalism, channeling social rage away from domestic failures and blaming everything on so-called foreign hostile forces. In the South China Sea, whenever the domestic economy sinks deeper into crisis, Chinese Coast Guard vessels ram Philippine supply ships with high-pressure water cannons. Each collision ignites a fresh wave of nationalist fervor at home. In the Taiwan Strait, whenever the regime needs to rally consensus or project strength, it stages large-scale military drills around Taiwan, missiles fired into the sea, warplanes pushing toward the coastline. These actions are not primarily aimed at Taiwan itself. They are signals sent to unemployed and disillusioned young people at home. The nation is strong, and your anger should be directed outward. The most extreme manifestation of this strategy has been directed at Japan. When Japanese Prime Minister Sanea Taikachi declared that a Taiwan contingency is a Japan contingency, the state propaganda machine moved into overdrive. From a sweeping ban on Japanese seafood to so-called spontaneous public boycotts of Japanese travel and products, a nationwide wave of anti-Japanese hysteria was ignited almost overnight. This hatred seeped into every corner of Chinese society, and violence followed as a matter of course. A Japanese mother and child stabbed near a school, an American visiting scholar assaulted. These incidents are no longer isolated or rare. The logic is nearly identical to that of the Red Guards beating the 5 black categories during the old Cultural Revolution. The only difference is that the targets of struggle are no longer internal class enemies, but external national enemies. But this script quickly traps Xi Jinping himself in a dead end. Mao Zedong could shut the country off from the world and let the Red Guards smash everything in sight. Xi cannot. On one hand, he desperately needs Western markets and technology to keep an economy on life support from flatlining. On the other, he must continuously stoke domestic nationalism to divert internal contradictions. The result is a schizophrenic dilemma. On one side, he unleashes wolf warrior diplomats and hyper-nationalist youth to scream at the outside world as proof of the regime's toughness and legitimacy. On the other, he must keep an iron grip around their necks, terrified that if they spiral out of control, China's economic lifelines will be severed entirely. The fire beneath the pressure cooker is being fanned ever higher, while the release valve on top is clamped shut. This rage, unable to escape outward, continues to accumulate, compress, and turn inward across Chinese society. When it finally detonates, it will burn through every corner of the country, and once the flames lose control, they will no longer obey anyone. In the end, what will be consumed is not the imagined external enemy, but the entire communist system that Xi Jinping himself has been desperately trying to hold together.
That's all for today. The conversation continues in the comments below. If this story must be told, help us tell it. Like, subscribe, and share. We'll see you next time.